So we're reading from Ephesians 2, verse 11. Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who called themselves the circumcision, that done in the body by the hands of men. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace, and in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, built on the foundations of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Walls and fences and hedges divide. And sometimes that's a good thing, because if you've got a garden, you want to know what you need to mow and weed and what you don't need to mow and weed. And even when you haven't got one of those walls that people like to build, isn't that strange? You get a postage stamp of a garden, and people insist on having a fence or a landai 20 feet high all the way around it. You know, this is my space. No one is going to look in and see what I am doing. I always wonder what people think they're hiding behind such a high hedge. But that's just my nosiness, really, rather than anything else. But even when people haven't got that, you know that people mow only up to their boundary, even if you can't see it. You don't get people usually mowing somebody else's lawn without saying, "Can I mow your lawn?" People get upset if you start weeding and digging around into someone else's garden. People come out and say, "Oi, what are you doing?" So sometimes boundaries are actually quite useful things, because they tell where your responsibility ends and somebody else's begins. It's a useful thing, not only physically, but also in terms of our own lives. It's useful to know where my boundaries are. And that's actually what we say in the Lord's Prayer: forgive us our trespasses. We've trespassed upon somebody else's territory. We've crossed a boundary. We've done something which we ought not to have done. We've trespassed on somebody else's space. And so we're saying, "Lord, forgive us." And we ask that other person to forgive us when we have interrupted and invaded their space, their boundary. And that's perfectly right and proper, that we have boundaries within our lives. I think children find it hard to realise that no can be a complete sentence. Can I? No. But so-and-so is. No. Because we have to create boundaries for children in order to keep them safe. If you don't have a boundary for children who are 4 years old, the chances are they won't reach 5, because they will want to do things that is actually quite dangerous for them. So you put boundaries around. But as they get older, they need to have learned their own boundaries and their own space and what is right and proper for them. And so boundaries can be good things. But boundaries can also be bad as well. And we need to know what the distinctions are. And one of the distinctions is basically if we're excluding people from the family of God because of their background or who they are, then we're doing something that Jesus never did. Because he called the outcasts. Horror of horrors. He called people who were beyond the boundaries of Judaism. He called people who were the lowest of the low. He called people who were excluded already. The tax collectors, the sinners, the lepers, those who were beyond the pale, as it were. And Jesus broke down, if you like, as Paul says in verse 14, the dividing wall of hostility. And Paul means that dividing wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles. It wasn't just the Gentiles looked upon the Jews as just being slightly weird. The Jews looked upon the Gentiles as being people who were of no significance whatsoever. And so they used to thank God that they weren't made a Gentile, that God had made them a Jew, because they were special. They were God's chosen people. They were people whom God had said, I want you. And they puffed out their chest and said, yes, I know why. Because I am wonderful and beautiful and lovely. And God really knew what he was doing when he chose me. But he didn't choose them. They're Gentiles. They are just a bit, And we're not going to eat with them. And if I find that they've been using a utensil to eat with, I'll make sure it's washed properly before, even if it has been washed, I'll go through the ceremonial washing to make sure that it is really clean. I'm not going to eat with them. I'm not going to spend any time with them if I can really avoid it. Because they are nobody. They are totally a nobody. Because I am a somebody. And you could, just walked around having that kind of attitude the whole time. No wonder the Gentiles that they mixed with got thoroughly fed up with this. Constantly being told that you are just worth even less than dirt. No wonder the Gentiles got a bit peeved and sort of started to hit back when that kind of attitude was being around. But those similar divisions are still today. We still have those similar divisions. The Jews don't actually act like that anymore. But divisions still exist. The most dangerous places in the world are places where there have been divisions put up between North and South Korea. Just try and walk through and see what happens. No, don't do it. It's not advisable. People that go to parts of Syria and Iraq probably wouldn't come back. Because the dividing wall of hostility is there. It's not a physical wall, but it's there nonetheless. You can see it all around. You might have all kinds of views about Europe. I don't want to get into a sort of political debate, but one of the things that caused people after the Second World War was firstly that Christians didn't want to see a repeat of the Second World War. They didn't want to see Europe completely at each other's throats. So they wanted to see a Europe that was united. They wanted to see a Europe that had no barriers, where people could travel from one end of the Europe to another and live in peace, wholeness. Who had a vision amongst Christians. They wanted to see a Europe which would never ever go to war again. And so Jesus brings down these dividing walls of hostility. So we shouldn't see hostility walls within the church. We'll have boundaries within our personal space, and that's right and proper. But we shouldn't have walls of hostility within the church. Because, as it says in verse 16, Jesus has broken those walls down. There is no alienation from one person to another. So we don't ignore differences. There were differences with those 5 who came and stood at the front earlier on with the letters P-E-A-C-E. There were very great differences. Some were very young, some were a little older. But there were differences. People are different. And to try and say that we're all the same is ignoring the reality. You know, you've just got to ask, I'm not going to, but if you asked, who did you vote for? You would, in the last election, you would have a cross-section of people's political opinions. You would ask, okay, what's your favourite food? And you'd have a complete cross-section from things that other people wouldn't stand near them, like Marmite in my case. And other people go, oh yes, bring Marmite on, yes, more and more Marmite. Yes, Marmite rules the world. But other people just love it, other people hate it. But that's okay. So people who love Marmite aren't going on a crusade saying, everybody's got to love Marmite, are they? They're just going to say, okay, if you don't like Marmite, that's your loss. It's our game because it's more for us. So you don't have to all be the same. You don't have to all like the same things. You don't have to all like the same music. You don't have to all like the same literature. You don't have to all like doing things on your holidays. We went on holiday, we had a marvellous time. For some people, they would hate it because they like doing other kind of things on holiday. And that's okay. Do whatever you want to do. Be the person that God has made you to be. Don't be a clone of somebody else. I think when we're growing up, aren't we? We kind of want to fit in. So we kind of bury the things that we like in order to fit in with the group around us. But as we get older, we think, oh, blow that. I'm going to eat what I want to eat. I'm going to like what I want to like. I'm just going to be me. Some of us, sadly, never ever get to that point. We all want to always kind of fit in. So there are differences that we shouldn't ignore. But we should use them as a strength. So that it doesn't matter that we are all different. In fact, it is a strength. So this building that we are sitting in, the walls are not made... If we didn't have windows, we wouldn't be able to see out or light come in. But the windows are not the walls. They're not the roof. You don't build the roof with the same materials as you build the wall or the floor. They're all different, but they all make up the building that we are sitting in. Yes? So in that case, why do we complain bitterly if someone is just a tad different from us who is inhabiting this space with us? Why do we complain bitterly when the person sitting next to us, or maybe sitting across from us, doesn't like the same kind of things that we like in terms of music in worship? Or doesn't like doing the kind of things that we like to do in worship? That we make them out to be someone that's slightly unspiritual because they don't do the things that we do. So some of us might like to sort of leap up and down and put our hands in the air. And so we'll look down on others that are not doing that. But those who are not doing that think, oh, they're just too exuberant. They can't control themselves. What's up with them? Kind of bit of respect. We're in the house of God. And so we look down on each other because we do things in different ways. Why? Why is that the case? When you look at siblings, sometimes you wonder that they actually came out of the same gene pool because they are so different from each other. They do not do the same things that their brother or sister does. They like different things. And yet, surprise, surprise, they are siblings. They are from the same gene pool. And yet they are not the same. I have watched this interesting program while I was away about identical twins. Did you see that? It was brilliant, wasn't it? And even though they are identical, they are not the same. They are different. And now they can even work out, it takes some months apparently, but they can even find DNA differences within identical twins. So, you know, identical twins, if they thought they could get away with a crime because, you know, the DNA wouldn't spot it, it doesn't. They can actually do it. It might take a little time, but it will come through in the end. So even though the DNA on the surface looks the same, underneath, I don't know how they, or what the differences are, but there are differences. And so even identical twins aren't quite the same. They are different. Their fingerprints are different. They like different things. They're not the same. So why do we expect a kind of uniformity within church? Didn't it used to be that, you know, going to church, you put on your Sunday best? So, and some people are brought up and still have this kind of thing that if they haven't got a tie on when they go to church, they are kind of not quite dressed properly. But I had an epiphany, a kind of a Damascus Road experience, really. Because when I went to the first Baptist church I went to when I was a teenager, there were kind of, as I said earlier on in previous times, there were people who were much older than me there. In fact, I was probably the youngest there. And they did wear things like their demob suit, and they had squeaky boots, and they had Brill-creamed hair and short back and sides and all the rest of it. But there were one or two people who were a bit older than me, about my brother's age, that used to go to the church. So they were in their early 20s. There weren't many of them, about 2 or 3. And one time the minister says, we'll take up the offering. And this guy came on who was wearing cut-down jeans, a T-shirt, and he looked as if he'd been under the car. Well, he actually was. He was a mechanic. So he still was looking a bit greasy. And he took up the offering. And his kind of chin just sort of jutted out a bit at the bottom end. So he kind of ran with the offertory plate going... Looked a bit threatening, really. But it was just different. He wasn't doing... You know, someone who was at the front wasn't dressed in a suit. Weren't dressed with a tie on. In fact, he didn't have a shirt on. He had a T-shirt on. And cut-down jeans, for heaven's sake. And sandals without socks. In church. How could he do it? He wasn't struck down immediately as he came into church because he was dressed like this. No. Because God says the hostility walls have been broken down. We're all one in Christ. It really doesn't matter. Those things do not matter. So if I come in cut-down jeans, you know, don't worry about it. It has to be really hot for me to want to do that. But it doesn't matter. That's the thing. We are different in our likes and our ways of doing things. So, we have peace from God. Verse 16, Jesus allows us to make peace with God. Verse 13, this peace brings us closer to God. As we have peace with God, so we can get closer and closer to Him. Sometimes you think, I can't get any closer to God. I'm really as close as I could possibly be. And yet, we find that we can get closer to God. We can get just that little bit closer. It's like blowing a balloon up. You think, oh, I can't get any more air in. And you find you can. I think, oh. But unlike a balloon, don't take analogies too far, they break. Unlike a balloon, we won't burst as we get closer to God. Because we can grow closer to Him. But if that is the case, if verse 13 is true, that we can get closer to God, we can also get closer to each other. And this is the key thing that Paul wants to say, is because we have peace with God, we can have peace with one another. That we are whole and united together through Christ. There are no walls anymore. None. Not those walls that exclude you because you are different. Yes, you are different, and that's good. But there is no wall that makes you excluded anymore because you're different. So you can't look at your brother and sister and say, ooh, they do things in a bit of a different way. Ooh, I don't want to mix with them too much, I might get contaminated. You can't think like that, because the wall's broken down. But you can say, what can I learn from my brother and sister who does it this way? What can I learn from the person that doesn't put their hand up in worship? What can I learn from the person that really likes quiet and silence, rather than exuberance and noise? What can I learn from the person who wishes to be quiet before God? What is making them tick? Conversely, what can I learn from the person that does like to put their arm up in worship? What can I learn from the person that is exuberant in their praise? What can I learn from each other? Yes? Much better question to ask, isn't it? Than saying, ooh, they're different. What can I learn from those differences? So this church, Four Oaks Baptist Church, our church, offers a setting where different people are brought together. Look around. We are different. And that is good. That we are not the same. That is a reason to celebrate, is it not? Is it a reason to say, oh yes, we are different, and that's okay. We don't have to be the same. I don't have to be a person that prays like you. You don't have to be a person that prays like me. We can do it in our own way, and that is fine. Some people like to pray out loud. Some people like to pray silently. That is fine. Isn't that something to celebrate? I think it is.